This inquiry will help, but it won't go as far as some members of our parliament and some members of our public want. It won't go to issues of blame. It's very forward-looking, the resolution. It talks about tracing the origins of the disease and working out how to prevent something like this from spreading again in the future. So it won't go to the impact that the Chinese political system has had on the global pandemic that we're now facing.
And that's interesting, isn't it? As you say, you can be forward-facing, but you'd also like to know about the cover-up, whistleblowers not allowed to speak, and the fact that, yes, China eventually put Wuhan in lockdown, but it was too late, and that's a big part of the reason we've got a global pandemic now.
I think the things we should get clarity on under this investigation are where the first patients were detected, what sort of treatment was given to them early on, what kind of reporting went to the WHO from China and when that happened, and also some of the responses from other countries. But you're right, it probably won't go into that detail of the doctors who were encouraged not to do reporting or who were even detained for reporting the outbreak of this virus, or indeed the censorship of Chinese social media discussion about the virus when it was emerging.
I guess, though, James, if you get the timelines you were just mentioning there, then you can sort of join the dots on when people and who and so on should have known more about this.
I think that will become very obvious, and so you've got this incredible support from a large number of countries to understand how this happened and why, and that will focus a lot of attention on China. But China, I think now, having accepted that this inquiry will go forward, will very much be focused on managing the process of the inquiry, not allowing it to cast any blame on their leadership and not allowing it to detract from some of their global initiatives like Belt and Road.
And of course, the other reaction, the Chinese Communist Party slapping 80% tariffs on Australian barley, which, it seems absurd, the 80%, apart from anything else. We even had the Commerce Minister refuse to take any questions on this from Australian journalists or anyone else, even though the journalists had to register 3 days ahead of this event. I mean, does it highlight that even as China says it's cooperating, it's retaliating?
Look, there's a deep divide between how Australia is viewing this. If you talk to the finance community in Sydney, they see this as a logical outflow of the US-China trade deal, that there'll need to be a shift from buying from Australian agricultural sources to US agricultural sources. If you talk to Canberra, this is very much retaliation for Australia standing up and being counted and pushing for this inquiry into the origins of coronavirus. So it's really laying bare some of the difficulties in Australia formulating a response to this when we can't even really agree on what's motivating it. I think the truth is somewhere in between. The US trade situation is shaping this, but clearly there are deepening tensions between Australia and China, and the fact that our ministers can't get meetings, our prime ministers can't get phone calls, that shows the tension that there is in the relationship at the moment.
Right, and that surely that has to demonstrate that it's not just about the finance sector's theory when you've got, yes, phone calls not being returned at a ministerial level, you've got this extraordinary threat issued as well by the ambassador here in Canberra not so long ago about beef. Remember, beef, suddenly there was an issue with 4 of our abattoirs. I guess the big question now is going to be, is this a one-off retaliation, in which case I think Australia would go, well, not ideal, but we'll cop it, or is this the start of something a lot worse?
Well, there was an interesting article in China's Global Times last week laying out what sectors it thinks are immediately vulnerable in Australia and what sectors aren't. And it pointed to the fact that iron ore will continue, iron ore exports from Australia to China are likely to continue, but that China is looking quite seriously at how to dislocate that and replace it with African iron ore in the next 5 years. But it did point to the agriculture sector being vulnerable. And I think looking at what China is saying and looking at what China is doing, you would think that is where the brunt of the retaliation will be found. Limiting Australian exports, finding existing disputes and upping the ante on those to make life more difficult for Australian agricultural exporters.
Is there much the government can do? Its strategy, talking to the Agriculture Minister yesterday, was, well, look, we'll open up more markets. It's totally up to producers and farmers. This is what they do. Do we need something more concrete where you say, here's our China alliance right now, we need to get it down to here, or is that too prescriptive?
Look, I think we're in a good position. Deals like the TPP, for example, have opened up the Chinese market to Australian agriculture in ways that it wasn't open before. We've got a better deal with China on many levels than the United States has. So that gives us greater options in terms of other trade partners we can look at. We're still doing a lot of exports into the Middle East. So Australia, because of the work that's been done on trade deals in the last 5 to 10 years, is in a good position, as good a position as it could be. And we're not as vulnerable as we might think. I mean, this will obviously be hard for some suppliers, but in terms of the overall Australian economy, it won't devastate the Australian economy anywhere near as much as the coronavirus already has.
Just turning focus to the US, look, I guess we'll start with this interesting news conference with Donald Trump talking about taking hydroxychloroquine. He's using it as some sort of preventative, even though there's advice out there this is pretty dangerous. What did you make of this? Is this the distraction that I'm falling for, amongst others?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's this sort of colour that President Trump deploys to great effect all the time. He also mentioned he's taking zinc, so you can expect to see drugstores across the US sell out of zinc in the next couple of days. But this is one of the challenges in the whole United States response that's been led by the Trump administration. The president making off-the-cuff remarks that have quite, in some cases, deadly consequences. This drug, the jury is still out on whether it's helpful. These drugs are quite powerful. If you've ever taken antimalarial drugs, you know how powerful they are. And to be taking this without any proof that it actually helps, when the president doesn't have coronavirus, despite the fact that he's getting tested every day, it's a curious decision. It's an even more curious decision, and you might say reckless, to effectively endorse that on national TV. And that's one of the difficulties we've seen with Trump's whole response to this crisis.
Yeah, given the extent to which his supporters basically approve anything that he does. We're nearly out of time, do you think there's a quiet hope amongst the Australian government, perhaps in defence as well, that Donald Trump loses the next election just because he's so unpredictable, you just don't know what you're going to get, and it's such a fraught time? Would there still be a bit of a, well, at least he keeps China on their toes sort of feeling? What do you think?
Look, I think right now Australia can trust US institutions, but we can't trust the individual. So we can't trust President Trump's decision-making. It's erratic, it's irrational at times, and it often goes against Australia's shared interests with the United States. The longer the president is there, the greater the impact he has on the institution. So I think if we see a Trump second term, Australian officials will be concerned about the extent to which they can trust US institutions as he increases his hold and power over them.